Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're looking at the 21st century for the United States, the dawn of a new American century. So, let's get started. In the wake of the Cold War, we see that military dictators that the Soviets and us had kind of kept afloat with cash, with money, with power, with whatever, now found that they didn't have the big support that they used to. And they went from being the power in the region to just another warlord. And sometimes this meant that they were replaced, sometimes this meant they were toppled, sometimes they use extreme methods in order to stay in power. And in a lot of Arab nations, we see that rule evaders during this time had created this popular support within the state by denouncing Israel, the nation that had been born because of the Second World War, a nation that didn't exist prior to 1947. And we encouraged Israel to trade land for peace between the other Arab leaders, and the Israelis were not exactly keen to do this. They thought that this was an act of capitulation that would just continue to snowball. Israel relied on us for support, and we did make them a nation and backed them very early on, which led to Arab discontent with both Israel and us. When we talk about terrorism in the 20th century, this is the map of the major terrorist activities that took place from 1995 to 2005. There's a lot going on, and it's across the world. In 1998, Osama bin Laden, who had been instrumental in fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan back in the 80s and had been backed by us, declares a religious edict to all Muslims across the world that they needed to rise up and kill Americans and their allies, both civilians and military targets. He was an extremist. He was he was the leader of this organization called Al Qaeda. He was protected by the government of Afghanistan, the Taliban, and they and he had and his group had been responsible for bombing the U.S. embassies in Africa. The morning of September 11th, 2001, our first indicator that things were going to happen happened at 8:40 a.m. And that was when a flight attendant, Madeline Sweeney, called her boss on her cell phone and said that pilot, co-pilot were dead and the plane had been taken over by a couple of Arab guys. Boss asked, okay, what were their names? Where were their seats? She relays this information, and the next thing we know, New York is under attack. It's a massive plane flying 500 miles an hour that hit the North Tower at just before 9. 15 minutes later, the Southern Tower was hit. Half an hour later, a third plane crashed into the Pentagon. A fourth plane was actually taken over by the people on board, tried to take it under control, and the hijackers put the plane in the ground and killed everyone on board doing this. By 9:35, the president authorized the Air Force to shoot down any other hijacked plane, any plane that was not responding to calls, communiques, anything like that. By the time the attacks were over on September 11, 2001, 3,000 people were dead in New York, hundreds more dead in the Pentagon, and we had learned that they were small groups that were responsible for acting to do this, the small cells. These individuals were linked to Al Qaeda, they were linked to Osama bin Laden, and he was still in Afghanistan at this time. We see that the day it happens, the President of the United States, President George Bush Jr., gets on TV. He says that the terrorists who did this will be found, and any government that is harboring them will be brought to justice. A few weeks later, after we'd cleared who is in charge of this being bin Laden, we see that the offer is dead or alive, $25 million for him. And this was, I mean, that's a lot of money. The thought was we put out so much money that somebody would know somebody who knew something that would bring him in. Didn't work as quick as we thought it was going to. We do see that there will be people who are arrested, detained on suspicions of working with Al-Qaeda, of having connections to the Taliban, to bin Laden. We see that there's letters that start going out to government officials that had threats and in some cases anthrax spores on them. And we see that in reaction to all of this, the United States creates the Department of Homeland Security, HLS, and their large goal is to make sure this stuff doesn't happen. The Patriot Act is passed during this time, which gave Congress unprecedented abilities to pass on to law enforcement for stop and search, for detain, for search without warrant, and allowed for detainees to be kept at the U.S. Naval Base, Guantanamo Bay, a naval base that was located in Cuba. And people who were sent here they could see a tribunal, they could see a court without seeing a lawyer, without being officially charged, and they could be incarcerated permanently. September 20th, Bush orders the Taliban to turn over bin Laden and top al-Qaeda leadership. The Taliban refuses, so we see Bush unleashing military attacks on Afghanistan. Bombs, dropping bombs, firing missiles. And this was the same thing that we had done in the first Persian Gulf War and assumed, oh, this is going to work just fine here, not realizing the stronghold infrastructures, the mountain bunkers that had been built into Afghanistan. The nature of the nation made it much more different than fighting in the Persian Gulf. The fear that this was going to happen again led to the use of torture to get information out of prisoners and detainees. And this was a violation of the Geneva Convention, a violation of good ethics. Pictures came out from prisons where prisoners were dressed up and put in humiliating positions and degraded and tortured. The reactions of this was that this was happening, and sometimes the justification was it was used to find threats to the nation, but it was not as successful as anyone would have ever, well, it was not successful, period. September 2002, Bush wanted congressional support, stating that the Iraqi leader, Saddam Hussein, had weapons of mass destruction hidden throughout Iraq. And we had been whipped into such a frenzy from the war that we would have gone anywhere to fight terrorism. And the thing is, we had given Saddam sarin gas in the past, so it was not unrealistic that he had other weapons of mass destruction. And following the first Persian Gulf War, that was one of the big things that was forced onto Iraq. They had to let in the weapons inspectors. And when they didn't always do this, it gave credence that there was something to hide. In March 2003, the United States started the assault on Iraq when there's continued pressure that, there's something there, that we needed to safeguard the nation. And these forces entered Iraq quickly, captured the capital swiftly, airports, means of defense, and the Iraqis were really unable to defend against a force like this. By April 4th, the United States had seized Baghdad proper, as well as the outlying areas. Some people came into the streets to celebrate, the Hussein's regime was done. Some people started looting, and Saddam himself just disappeared. He Houdini'd. And within the next 2 weeks, major combat operations were done. It looked like, hooray, we had won, but Iraq was in chaos. There was no infrastructure left over. And then the realization was, okay, what are we going to do with Iraq? Because if we leave it now, then this whole nation is going to just fall apart, or someone worse than Saddam is going to take over. So we needed to rebuild it in a way we wanted it to be an idea that it would be friendly in the future. Under Bush, the economy starts to slip, and it slips right into a recession. When Bush took office, there was a massive surplus. By this point, we see more and more manufacturing jobs are going to disappear. More jobs are outsourced. The national income starts to disappear. And when the election of 2004 happens, the war was the topic for the campaign. The Republicans they put Bush Jr. back up for re-election. The Democrats will select Senator John Kerry as their candidate, and Bush mobilized conservatives. He was not too popular in 2004. The way the war was going, the fact that we hadn't found Saddam, that we hadn't found bin Laden, that the economy was going poorly, Bush mobilized conservatives saying that we needed a constitutional amendment to define marriage as between a man and a woman. And without him making this big movement, without rallying the fundamental Christians and conservatives, he probably would not have won in 2004. The margin of victory was really, really narrow that we see here. With shrinking crime as an infrastructure component, we see there is a focus on dealing with immigration. And one of the ways that the federal government wanted to deal with immigration was to put up a border fence. And by late 2006, a fence was being constructed. It was about 700 miles, and but it was just a fence. It was a fence that, some people could tear down or drive through or throw a ladder over, or at one point, some drug cartels created a underground tunnel system complete with air conditioning and lights. In 2005, the National Weather Service, August 28th, 2005, Tropical Storm Katrina becomes Hurricane Katrina. It starts heading towards the Gulf of Mexico. The federal officials say, you better get out of this region because it's going to be bad. Millions leave, but about 100,000 people of New Orleans just stick around. 10,000 people are going to go to the Superdome, which was a concrete football stadium that was in New Orleans and still there. And when Katrina made landfall, it was devastating to the region and the people of New Orleans. 25,000 people went into the Superdome, and you can see it depicted there with waist-high waters. And the devastation in New Orleans was so bad that it took a while for people to realize how bad it was. Millions of people were a million plus people were displaced. There was dead bodies rotting in the streets. There was sewage. There was food. There was toxic waters and toxic crud. And it took days before FEMA was able to organize a reaction to this. There was a lot of finger pointing going around, between the engineers who said the city had been overdeveloped, that the canal system was never designed to hold a city this big, that the evacuation, even though it happened, people just chose not to leave. All of this happened at once. And in the reaction to all of this, we see that in the midterm election, there's big gains for Democrats as the popularity for Republicans continues to spiral downwards. The first female Speaker of the House will be Nancy Pelosi, and at the end of Bush's second term, his popularity is at historic lows. One thing that surprised everyone and that it actually happened was in the fall of 2006, Saddam Hussein was convicted. He was convicted of crimes against humanity, and he was executed by his own people. He was executed by hanging, and that was that. Even though he was dead, the thing about Iraq was it still needed a lot of work. To a lot of Americans, the idea of wealth is associated with the idea of home ownership. And in 2008, well, actually prior to this, banks had started handing out what were called subprime mortgages. And these were mortgages that were for individuals who did not have a lot of capital, who did not have a large income, but this way they could still afford a home. Unfortunately, subprime mortgages also are tied to the market, so the mortgage rates can fluctuate. When these mortgages started to collapse and the economy starts to slip more than it had, mortgage rates start to go up by a lot, very quickly. And this creates the popping of the housing market bubble, which is the thing that leads to the Great Recession of the early 21st century. The banks start making loans, business starts drying up, the stock market starts collapsing, and this was the longest recession since the Great Depression of the 30s. In 2008, the two candidates that we see for president are going to be Republican John McCain and Democrat Barack Obama. The legacy and the history and the impact that McCain had as a senator had won him a lot of popularity. The fact that so many of the problems of the early 21st century were blamed on Republicans and the president did not, however, help him too much. The decision of him to choose the governor of Alaska as his running mate seemed to cement the end of his presidential career, and Barack Obama became the president. Obama's victory seemed to mark the end of that political age that we see the first decade of the 21st century dominate as. Republicans had appealed to patriotism, to lower taxes, to the changes that needed to happen. Democrats, at this point, they get the presidency in 2008. They gain majority of the Senate and the House, and this is it as we see it. What happens next is what we call current events. It's one of the things we see with studying history. There's always about 20 years before we can really call it history. So what we live in now is the world we live in now. created by the world that was created. I hope you learned something today. I'll see you next time.